Okay, welcome to our Lunch and Learn today. We're going to talk about the book of Ruth. So last week we talked about the Song of Songs, which we read on Passover. And Passover is supposed to represent the romance of God and the people of Israel. And so it's all about romance and love and even a little sexuality in there. And so that's why we read the Song of Songs, which is full of all of those ideas. But now we come to Shavuot, and in the Jewish imagination, Shavuot represents the marriage, the wedding of God to the Israelite people. And in a Jewish marriage, you need to have a wedding contract, a ketubah. And in our case, the ketubah, of course, was God giving us the Ten Commandments. The groom normally gives the ketubah to the bride, and in this case, the ketubah the bride gets, the Israelites get, is the Ten Commandments. And so this is supposed to represent marriage. And consequently, we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot. One of the reasons for doing that is that this is about love, but a different kind of love than the Song of Songs. It's not the sexual sort of romantic, boy meets girl, girl meets boy kind of love. It's a deeper love. It's about commitment and responsibility and showing acts of kindness to each other and consistency. And that's exactly what the book of Ruth is about. So in that sense, it's a perfect book for Shavuot. Two other reasons why we read it on Shavuot. One is because it talks about the harvest season, and it's specifically the barley harvest leading into the wheat harvest. The barley harvest begins on Passover. The wheat harvest begins on Shavuot. And so it's a harvest festival, Shavuot, and therefore we read about the harvest in the book of Ruth. And a third reason that we read the story of the book of Ruth is it's about somebody who converts to Judaism, somebody who joins the Jewish people. Ruth, whose name symbolically recognizes her transformation into being a member of the Jewish people. I'll explain that in a minute. And in doing so, she takes on the commitments and responsibilities that the Jewish people or the Israelites took on at Mount Sinai, the commandments. God asks the Israelites, will you do what I ask you to do? And the Israelites say, yes, whatever you say we will do. And then they get the Ten Commandments. And here Ruth basically makes a similar kind of commitment. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. And she joins the Jewish people, taking on those responsibilities that the Israelites took on at Mount Sinai. So in that way, it also kind of reminds us of Shavuot. It's appropriate to read on Shavuot. What I propose to do now, I put a link up on my Facebook page on Monday to Sefaria, which is a fantastic website if you haven't seen it before. Sefaria has huge quantities of Jewish literature at your fingertips digitally, in English if it's available, or in Hebrew in the original. Not only the Bible, but also the Talmud, many passages of Midrash, Jewish legal works, philosophy works, tons of material on Sefaria. The link I posted on my Facebook page is directly to its page dealing with the book of Ruth. So if you don't have a Bible at home for whatever reason, you can read it online at Sefaria in Hebrew or English. And what I propose to do right now is kind of walk us through the 4 chapters of the book. It's a short book. I'm going to point out some linguistic and stylistic and narrative motifs in the storyline that I think are significant and important, explain a few passages that people are curious about, and then at the end I'll summarize some of the major themes of the book. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at chapter 1 of the book of Ruth. Right away at the beginning of the book, in the first few lines, first few verses, its tragedy strikes. The very first thing is there's a terrible famine in the land of Israel. And this family that lives in Bethlehem has no money. They're farmers, but they can't grow anything because there's a famine. The crops aren't growing. And so they feel they need to leave Israel. They cross the Jordan River into Moab, a neighboring country, in order to find some means of livelihood. And tragically, I guess that's related a little bit to some people's situation today where because of the coronavirus, many people are losing their jobs and they're feeling distressed and need to take drastic measures to find ways to earn a living. So this family leaves Bethlehem, they cross the Jordan River, they go into Moab, It's a mother and a father and two sons. So their names, interestingly enough, are not given right away. They just say a man, a woman, and their two sons leave, and only afterwards do you find out who their names are. So the father's name is Elimelech, the mother's name is Naomi, and their two sons, curious names. By the way, Elimelech means my God is king, and Naomi means pleasantness or sweetness, and we'll see how her name becomes very important later. The two sons' names are Machlon and Chilion, which would translate to something like sickly and diseased. Interesting names for their two sons. In any case, Machlon and Chilion, and then the Bible says these two sons marry two Moabite women. Machlon marries Ruth, and Chilion marries a woman named Orpah. So, and then, as I said, in the first opening few verses, there's tragedy striking. First, there's a famine. They travel to Moab. It seems like okay, the two kids marry, but then in the next verse, all the men die. The father dies, and the two sons die, and these three women are now bereft. The two daughters are husbandless. The mother is not only husbandless, but childless. And Naomi now feels that she is no longer Naomi. She is no longer pleasantness, sweetness. She feels bitter, and she will later tell the townspeople, don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara, because Mara means bitterness. Well, so that's what happens at the opening part of the story, and then Naomi then turns to her two daughters-in-law, and she says she's totally depressed. Her life has been completely destroyed. And she turns to her two daughters-in-law and she says, look, clearly there's nothing for me here but horrible things. I'm going to go back to my family home in Bethlehem. The famine, I heard, is over. I'll figure out some way to make a living there. You really should stay here with your people. You're young. You can find new husbands. You have your whole life ahead of you. Mine's basically over. I'm going to go back and suffer with my people. So the two daughters-in-law then say to her, they feel bad for her, and they say, no, we'll come with you. We'll follow you. And so a second time she says, no, really, I don't have any more sons for you to marry. That was a typical thing back then. If one person died, you could marry a brother or something like that. I don't have any more children for you to marry. If you came back with me, you'd be strangers in a strange land. I can't really help you. I don't have any money. There's nothing I can do for you if you follow me. Stay here. So Orpah agrees. She says, you know what? You're right. I'll just stay. But Naomi wants to continue. And then Naomi tries a third time to tell Ruth not to go. And at this point, she says, go back like your sister-in-law did to her people and her gods. But Ruth refuses for a third time, and then she makes her famous speech, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back from following you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I vow before God that nothing but death could part me from you. A very dramatic and heartfelt statement from Ruth. And at that point, Naomi relents and says, okay, you can follow me home. This idea of Naomi trying to dissuade Ruth from following her 3 times, essentially, is what gives rise in some Jewish sources to the idea that when somebody wants to convert to Judaism, to join the Jewish people, you should try and push them away 3 times, the way Naomi did with Ruth. But I should say that this was only a custom. It was not formalized in Jewish law. There's no actual requirement to push people away 3 times. But that's another subject. I'm happy to discuss it with people if they like. But in the Jewish tradition, that's not a requirement to push somebody away. But still, nevertheless, many rabbis do try to dissuade people from joining us based on this passage from the book of Ruth. In any case, they now return to Bethlehem, Everyone's excited to see them, but as I said, Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, sweet or pleasant, call me Mara or bitter, because Shaddai, God, has made my life bitter. And they arrive at the beginning of the barley harvest. And this would actually be, as I mentioned before, Passover. So they're arriving around Passover time. So now we come to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is about Boaz the Redeemer. So chapter 1 was dismal. The family left. They lost everything. Now the one mother and one daughter-in-law are returning, and they're totally dejected. Now comes chapter 2. Boaz the Redeemer. So Boaz is described as a man of substance. Ish Gibor Chayil. Gibor could also mean a hero, by the way. But he's a strong man of valor, a man of worth, man of substance. And he apparently has a huge plantation, a large farm that he actually can afford to hire workers to harvest for him. Now, we need to know, before we go any further in the book, something about the laws of harvesting. And so if you'll bear with me here, I'm going to switch to my outline to show you about the harvest season. So in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22, which comes, by the way, at the end of the discussion of the holiday of Shavuot. You can look it up in chapter 23 of Leviticus. It's about Shavuot, and then it has this information about harvests. It says the following: when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field, literally the corners of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. That's the stuff that falls on the ground. You should just leave that behind on the ground. Don't pick up every last sheaf of barley or wheat. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger, right? The foreigner. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. There it is in Hebrew. I just want to note also that in Deuteronomy it adds a third category of things you're not supposed to harvest. You should not harvest every last sheaf of grain or every last olive or grape off the tree or the vine. These are called forgotten items, shechecha in Hebrew. And so there's three things you're supposed to leave behind for poor people to gather when you're harvesting. One is peah, the corners of your field. One is leket, the gleanings that you leave on the ground. Don't pick up every last sheaf. And then the forgotten items. Don't pick every last thing off the tree or pluck every sheaf of grain out of the ground. You don't have to be so miserly and meticulous. Leave them for the poor people. Okay, so now we're back to the story. So Boaz is described as a man of substance, and here we are in the harvest season. And so Naomi says to Ruth, or Ruth actually says to Naomi, you know what? It's the harvest season. They're supposed to leave behind stuff for poor people. I'm going to go out for us. We don't have any food at home. I'm going to go out and get some food for us. Again, there's kind of an echo of what's going on in this world today, where it's a real adventure to go to the grocery store for some people, and some people have somebody else go to the grocery store for them because they ran out of food at home and somebody else has to go get food. So here, Ruth is going to take it upon herself to go get food for the family. And so she's going to go out into the fields. And it turns out, of course, that she ends up in the field of Boaz. Then we learn that Boaz had been away for a while because he's a man of some leisure. He's got a big property and he's got these field workers working for him. So he's been away. And he comes back to his plantation and he greets his workers. And he greets his workers with the expression, "May God bless you. May God be with you. Adonai imachem," which was apparently a form of greeting and is still a form of greeting in some circles today. And his workers reply, "May God bless you. Yevarechecha Adonai," right? May God bless you. So we understand from this important passage that Boaz is a religious man. He is a fearer of God. And as I like to mention when I talk about these things, somebody who is a God-fearer in the Bible doesn't mean it certainly doesn't mean a person who is afraid of God, which you might think from the English words. It means that somebody recognizes God's presence in the universe, acknowledges God's presence in the universe. But more importantly, it therefore leads the person to live a good life, to lead a life of kindness and compassion, a life of justice and honesty, because he fears God. So, what a God fearing person means in the Bible is a person who is moral, a person who is responsible, a person who does the right thing. That's what it really means, more than a statement about their beliefs, in my opinion. But in any case, you get that impression right here because he greets his workers with a religious greeting, and they respond in a religious greeting. And he then sees Ruth out in the field. He spies, somehow he sees Ruth, and he's like, wow, she's different. I haven't seen her before. Who is that woman? Now, from this, you might get the impression that she might have been an attractive woman, and there's other places in the text which would indicate that she was apparently very attractive, and that may be what attracted him. He was a man after all. But for whatever reason, he sees her, and then he turns to his supervisor, his field supervisor, and he says, who is that woman? And his field supervisor, who doesn't have a name, that's an important message, he doesn't have a name, he just says, she's some Moabite woman who returned with Naomi, right? So he doesn't give Ruth's name either. So one of the recurring themes in the story is about people having names or not having names. Remember, I mentioned at the beginning that none of the family members who left Bethlehem to go to Moab were originally named. They weren't named people until later in the story. Here, the field worker never knows his name, and he doesn't mention Naomi's name either. That's kind of significant. It's a thing that comes up in the story many times. So he says she came back with Naomi. She asked to glean behind the harvesters, and she has worked all day, hardly taking a break. And from this, you learn something about Ruth's character. She is a hardworking, diligent person, right? She goes about her business with full-heartedly. You know, she's out to glean. She's going to glean. She's hardly stopped for a drink. She's hardly stopped to eat. She's gleaning because she needs to get a lot of food to take back to her mother-in-law. So Boaz calls to Ruth and he says, listen, don't go to anybody else's field. Stay in my field and follow the women harvesters. And then he adds, I've told the men to leave you alone. Again, that's an indication that perhaps she was attractive, but also that the men may not have been so honorable ordinarily. So he has to tell them, leave this woman alone. Don't harm her. An interesting statement. But he's looking out for her. He wants to protect her. And then he says, and by the way, drink from the water that the men provide. The men are bringing jugs of water for the harvesters. You feel free to drink all you need to drink from the water they don't make yourself too thirsty. It's hot outside. Take care of yourself, right? He's really looking out for her. So then Ruth says, why are you so kind to me? And here again, this is a recurring theme of kindness. In Hebrew, the word chesed. The word chesed appears over and over again in the book of Ruth, and it's clearly a theme that flows throughout the story. In fact, the commentator suggests that the real reason, or at least one of the major reasons why Ruth followed Naomi back to Israel was because she really felt bad for her mother-in-law. Her mother, Ruth only lost a husband, and she is young. She could get remarried. But her mother-in-law lost both of her sons and her husband, and really is poor and has nothing, and is clearly feeling depressed and maybe even suicidal. And Ruth feels like she can't let this woman go home alone. Somebody has to take care of her. And Ruth takes it upon herself to really take care of her. And that's why she says to Naomi, I'll go get food for us, etc. So it's out of her kindness and compassion, her chesed for her mother-in-law, that sort of animates the story. And now she turns to Boaz and she says, you are showing me such kindness. Why are you so kind to me? I'm just a stranger here. I'm not even one of your workers. And Boaz says to her, I've been told all that you did for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, how you followed her and left behind your home and your parents, and you came to a people you had never known. Right? So he recognizes her act of chesed, her deep commitment to Naomi. And he says, that's why I'm going to show you kindness also, because you showed kindness to your mother-in-law. And then he adds, may you be rewarded with full compensation for all you have done from Yud He Vav He, from God, under whose wings you have sought refuge. So you have sought refuge by not only joining Naomi, but you said you made a commitment to the Jewish people and to the God of Israel. May God now show you kindness and favor for all the kindness you've done for your mother-in-law. And then at mealtime, in the middle of the day, everybody takes a break. It's hot outside. In Israel, I can tell you, it's hot outside in May. So they have little shady verandas or whatever that they go to rest for a while. They have a drink. They have some food. And apparently Boaz provides food for his workers and also for himself. And so he invites Ruth over to eat with him. So not only does she get to harvest, but he's inviting her to get free food. She's not his worker, but he invites her over anyway. And she gets more than enough food. She gets so much food, she has to take home a care package, right? She takes home, they didn't have cellophane back then or aluminum foil, but or Tupperware containers. But somehow she wraps up some extra food to take back with her home. He gives her so much food she can't even eat it all. And then he told the workers, then he tells the workers, and after she leaves, by the way, you see that woman? I want you to, you're supposed to leave behind stuff for the poor people following you to pick up. Leave extra behind for her. I want you to treat her extra special. Leave behind a bunch of extra stuff if you see her following you, so she'll have even more to collect. So he tells them to do that. So when Ruth returns home to Naomi, she has this enormous basket full of grain and leftover food. One of the commentators, I think, said something to the effect of like 50 pounds of stuff. I don't know how she schlepped it. Maybe she had to put it on wheels. I don't know. But about 50 pounds of grain she took back with her. And Naomi looks at that and she says, wow, how did you get so much stuff? Where did you get all this? It was like going to Walmart, and like open shopping. No, you don't have to pay for anything. Just throw everything in the cart and take it home. Where'd you get all this stuff? So she says, I don't know, some guy named Boaz. And Naomi says, oh, blessed be God, who has not failed in his kindness. Again, his chesed. So now God is showing kindness indeed. Boaz asked God to show kindness to them, and now God has shown kindness to them. And Naomi recognizes that is shown kindness in not leaving, in the kindness to the living and to the dead. Just a little textual note here in the Hebrew. The Hebrew for has not failed in his kindness. In Hebrew, it's lo azav chasdo. Lo azav chasdo. And azav, and I'm sure this is not an accident, because this is the way biblical Hebrew writers played with words. The word azav is ayin, zayin, bet, and if you scramble them up, you get the word Boaz, right? So at the very moment she's saying God has not abandoned you of his kindness, she's kind of hinting that non-abandonment is coming from Boaz. Okay, just a little textual note there. Okay, end of chapter 2. Now we're on to chapter 3. So now Naomi says to Ruth, it's at the end of the wheat harvest now. So we've finished the barley harvest, we finished the wheat harvest. So Shavuot is actually over already. It's kind of the middle of the summer. And she says to Ruth, go check out that Boaz guy again tonight. And this is what I want you to do. He's going to be winnowing the barley on the threshing floor. And you should take a bath. She actually says this. Take a bath, anoint yourself with oil. That means put on perfume. Dress up, look nice, and go out to the threshing floor towards evening. Wait till he finishes dinner. And by the way, with dinner comes some alcoholic beverage, so he's going to be mellow. And when he lies down, you go up to the threshing floor and uncover his feet, and he will tell you what to do. So Ruth does what she is told to do. Now, if this sounds suggestive to you, that's probably intentional. right? Anybody who reads that passage would realize that there's some sexual tension going on here besides everything else, right? Wait till he's mellow after he's eaten and drunk, and then you're wearing nice clothes and perfume and so on, and you're going to go up and lay at his feet, uncover his feet. So someone asked, what does it mean uncovering his feet? And that is left to the reader's imagination. It may simply be an innocent thing. She uncovers his feet, but it may be something suggestive of something more. Um, Clearly, though, it does seem that there was no sexual consummation of anything, as because at the end of the book they get married and they do. The book makes a point of saying this. It seems like the first time they actually have sexual relations after they're married. But something's going on here, and it's not simply lying at his feet, presumably. I mean, she's young and attractive, and as we're going to see, he's an older guy and single, and something's going on there. Okay, so in the middle of the night, Boaz has been sleeping while she's laying there, and he wakes up, and oh my God, there's a woman here. Who are you? Right? So he asked his servant earlier, who is that woman? And he didn't really get an answer. It's a Moabite woman. He didn't get her name. So he asks, who are you? And she says, my name is Ruth. So now he knows her name. Maybe he knew it before, but now she tells him. And she then says, spread your robe, your knafecha. So I'm going to come back to that word in Hebrew in a second. Spread your robe over me, for you are a redeeming kinsman. Again, this is a very suggestive thing she's saying. She doesn't, by the way, wait for him to tell her what to do. Naomi had said, uncover his feet and then he'll tell you what to do. She doesn't wait for him to tell her what to do. She says, spread your robe over me. One Bible scholar has suggested that was an act of marriage, or at least betrothal in some primitive circles, and says a suggestion of that is found in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8, if you want to look it up. So she may be saying, marry me, in a subtle kind of a way. For you are a redeeming kinsman. So when she says spread your robe over me, I said the Hebrew word for that was knafecha, which literally means your wing. Spread your wing over me. And Boaz had used the same expression when he asked God, in which he said that she has sought refuge under God's wings, right? Earlier he suggested that, and he used the same passage. You're seeking refuge under God's wings, knafav. So the same root now is Boaz. Again, hinting, remember we said azav chasdo, that God hasn't abandoned his kindness, and there was a hint of Boaz. Here again is a hint of Boaz, because Boaz himself said, God will spread his wings over you, and now Ruth is saying, spread your robe over me, right? So God is acting through Boaz. Okay, so then now Boaz says to her, this is an even greater act of kindness. Chesed, the word chesed again. You're coming here at the threshing floor, seemingly coming on to me, it seems, or asking me to marry you, is an act of even greater kindness than what you showed before. You could have chosen a much younger man. So now we know he's older. Whether a rich man or a poor man, you could have gotten a younger, healthier guy than me. I'm an older guy, and you're a young, apparently beautiful woman. Why are you doing this for me? Clearly not for your own benefit. You're doing it for the benefit of Naomi. So again, he is recognizing her act not as a selfish need for love and romance, but because she is trying to provide for her mother-in-law who's lost and depressed. So he recognizes this as an act of kindness on Ruth's part. And then he says to her, I will surely be your redeemer, but there is a relative who is closer in relationship, and if he wishes to be the redeemer, okay. If not, I will do it. Lie here until the morning. And then she leaves before it gets light outside so that no one will know that she had slept there. And then Boaz sends her home with a huge package of barley again. He sends her home with another a huge supply of food. So I need to say something about Redeemer here. This is about levirate marriage. So there's a concept in Judaism about levirate marriage. It's in the Torah, but it only applies to the brother of a deceased man. So the Torah says that if a man marries a woman and then he dies before they have children, the brother of the deceased man is supposed to marry the widow. This is a peculiar thing, but it's mentioned in the Bible. And the reason the brother is supposed to marry the widow is so that when they have a child, that child will be counted as the child of the deceased brother, so that the brother's name won't be lost. Again, this is a reference to the importance of names. The name of the brother won't be lost, that he will have somebody to carry the lineage of his name. So that's what levirate marriage was supposed to be, but it's only supposed to be for the brother of the deceased man, not a more distant relative. And Boaz is not a brother. He's a more distant relative. So here there's an interesting little thing. The author of the book of Ruth is playing on the idea of levirate marriage, but expanding it beyond the scope of what the Torah actually requires. Saying, oh, well, any relative can be a redeemer, but there's a closer relative to me, so he has first priority to try and redeem the deceased man's name and to preserve the property of the family. Okay, so that's what's going on there. So then Ruth returns to Naomi and tells her what happened. And now we're on to the final chapter, chapter 4, the thrilling conclusion. So Boaz waits at the gate. The gate of a city at those times was the meeting point, the gathering place. Again, sort of a reference to what we're doing now. We're not meeting at the gate. We're staying at home. But one day soon we'll be out in the public sphere, in the public arenas, the marketplace, and so on. So the gate was the place where the markets happened, where business transactions happened, where the judges met to try cases. So this is the place, the entrance to the city was the focal point of personal commerce, right? Interchanges. And so Boaz waits at the gate until this other distant relative appears, and then he gathers 10 elders of the city around him, and they make a formal judgment. He says, Naomi must sell the land that belonged to Elimelech. You are the next of kin, and so if you want to redeem the land, redeem it in the presence of these 10 elders. So that's one of the places where Judaism gets the idea that 10 people make a community, that because these 10 elders are gathered to make a judgment on this case. So here again, this distant relative is not given a name in the book. In fact, he's called Ploni Almoni, which is sort of like saying John Doe in Hebrew. John Doe in Hebrew is Ploni Almoni. He's not given a name. And it's even a disparaging kind of a name. It has a negative connotation in Hebrew, may have in biblical times as well. And so here he's intentionally not named. And so Ploni says, sure, I'll redeem the land. And then Boaz says, but if you redeem the land, you also have to marry Ruth the Moabite. And by the way, once you do that and you have children, your children will count as the children of her deceased husband, and the land will revert back to him instead. So you're redeeming the land now, and then having to marry her will end up being a waste of your money, basically, because you're going to lose the land and so on. So Ploni says, well, then never mind. I'm not interested. But again, that kind of sets up Boaz as being a very kind person. He doesn't care about the land. He cares about taking care of Ruth and taking care of Naomi. He wants to show great kindness to them because he sees in Ruth such a kind-hearted person that he wants her to succeed. He wants her to be benefited. So his kindness now, he's going to use his money to buy this land, and that he doesn't care that it's not going to be his land, that it's going to go to their child. So, so then there's this weird thing where Plony gives Boaz his sandal, or some people, it's not clear. Boaz may give Plony the sandal, and we're not sure what that means. A sandal is used in the levirate marriage context, where if the deceased husband's brother refuses to marry the woman, and do his duty as a good loyal brother, she's supposed to spit at him and take off his sandal and so on. So you take off his sandal. So there's a sandal involved in that ceremony. Maybe that's why there's a sandal here. It's not exactly clear. But they do that, and Boaz acquires the property of Elimelech and his sons. He agrees to marry Ruth the Moabite in order to perpetuate the name of the deceased on his estate so that his name will not disappear. Again, the emphasis on the name. Boaz knows clearly that why he's doing this is to perpetuate the name of the deceased, not for his own personal benefit. This is an act of his own kindness. So the elders say, may God make this woman, Ruth, like Rachel and Leah, and may your house be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Now that's an interesting allusion that the book of Ruth, the author of the book of Ruth, now makes explicit. So I urge everybody to go back and look up the story of Judah and Tamar, because there are several parallels in that story. Briefly, Judah had 3 sons. One of them married a woman named Tamar and then died. So according to the rules of levirate marriage, the next brother had to marry her. But he refused to do his duty and did not want to make her pregnant, so God punished him by killing him. And the 3rd son was too young to marry Tamar, and Judah said, wait. But he waited a long time, long after the 3rd son could have married her. So then Tamar basically seduces Judah, and they have a son together whose name is Peretz. So clearly a lot of parallels in that story. The book of Ruth now makes explicit reference to that parallel story, and we're going to see an important connection in a minute. So the elders say, may you be like Rachel and Leah. They say to Ruth, basically, may she be like Ruth and Leah, and may your marriage be like that of Judah and Tamar's, who brought forth Peretz. And then the final scene is that Boaz and Ruth do marry, and they have a son. And the women say to Naomi, blessed is God, who has not withheld a redeemer from you. He, the boy, will renew your life and sustain your old age, for he is born to your daughter-in-law, who loves you. Again, this idea of chesed, who loves you, although here I think the term is ahava, which means love, and is better than 7 sons. Ruth's love for Naomi is better than having 7 sons. Naomi became the foster mother. She treated her grandson basically like her own son. They named him Oved, which means servant. And Oved was the father of Yishai, Jesse, and Jesse is the father of King David. And then the end of the book of Ruth gives you the lineage of 10 generations from Peretz, that story of Judah and Tamar, right? They had a son named Peretz, and from Peretz to David is 10 generations. And so there's the linkage also with Judah and Tamar to the story of Ruth, because it's Ruth and Boaz who give birth to a son, and the grandson of that son is King David. But if you go back further, you go back to the story of Judah and Tamar. So that's in short the book of Ruth. You can read it again yourself. As I mentioned, one of the major themes of this story is an acts of loving kindness. First, Ruth behaves with such compassion and kindness towards her mother-in-law that nothing will deter her from taking care of her. She's going to go back to a strange land, and she says, your people will be my people and your God my God. I want to be part of you because I'm going to take care of you, and this is what I really want to do. In turn, Boaz shows tremendous kindness to Ruth and Naomi by giving them extra food and helping them, and ultimately redeeming the land and the property and the family name. And in return, God rewards them all with the ultimate act of loving kindness by enabling them to be the ancestors of King David. What could be better than that in Jewish history? And so it's a lot about acts of kindness. And as I said at the beginning, that's what a marriage is about. It's about continuing acts of kindness and commitment to each other. Ruth absolutely commits herself not only to Naomi, but to the Jewish people and to the Jewish God. Tremendous act of commitment and faith. And that's a lot of what a marriage is about. It's also about names. And here I want to say that why is it obsessed with names and not having names? Because a name, and certainly in the ancient world, and to some extent in the modern world, helped define who a person was. Biblical names are often representative of a character, of the kind of person that person is. My parents named me Simcha, which means joy and happiness, and I often feel like I'm happy and joyful. I don't think it's because they named me that. It probably was an accident. But in some cases, even today, names do reflect who a person is. But they certainly, even if they don't actually reflect who a person is, it's like knowing somebody's name is like really an attempt to try and understand who they are internally. Whereas if you don't know their names, it's like they could be anybody. They're anonymous. They're not specific people. They're just characters that kind of come in and out of the story because they have a certain plot element, but we don't really need to know who they are. Once you name somebody, they're important, and we need to know about them. And so naming is really about identity and about treating people as full individuals, full human beings. That's what the importance of names is, and that's why I think it's important in this book. Part of showing loving kindness to another person is really understanding who they are as a person and truly trying to get to know them. And that includes, being able to call them by name. So, and finally, the book is about conversion. And here there's many modern Bible scholars would say the book, although it supposedly takes place in the period of the Judges, before the kingship was established, right? It's before King David and before King Saul. But even though it's set in that time in the past, modern Bible scholars say it probably was written after the return from the Babylonian exile sometime. So here there is some tension between the book of Ruth and the books of Nehemiah, Ezra, Nehemiah. So Ezra chapter 9 to 10 and Nehemiah chapter 13 verses 23 to 29 make it very clear that the Judahites, the people who were taken captive into Babylonia and are now returning from the exile, the men particularly are supposed to push away these foreign women that they've married, those pagans. They're disrupting the life of the Jewish people. They haven't really adopted the Jewish way of life. They haven't adopted the Jewish religion, and they're teaching their kids to be pagans. You need to get rid of them because we're trying to recreate our nation, and our religion and our way of life here in our homeland, and they're interfering with us being unified in that mission. And even the Torah itself, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verse 4, says, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of God." You're not supposed to marry Moabite women. And yet, here, Ruth is, in fact, a Moabite woman who marries an Israelite. Not only does she do that, but her great-grandson is King David. So clearly, God's not unhappy that Boaz married Ruth. Right? So the book of Ruth seems to stand in contrast to not only the book of Deuteronomy, which says don't marry Moabite women, but also the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah, who said get rid of those foreign wives that you've married. Why? So some scholars will say that the book of Ruth was this sort of a counter move to Ezra and Nehemiah. But another way to look at it is that Ezra and Nehemiah were concerned again about maintaining our Jewish way of life. And their concern was that many of these women who had married Israelite men or Judahite men were not really doing Jewish customs. They weren't keeping a Jewish home, raising Jewish children in the beliefs and Jewish way of life and practice and belief. Whereas Ruth, remember, was completely committed to being Jewish. She said, "Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Right? I'm totally with this program and agenda. I want to be part of your people. And so what the author of the book of Ruth is saying is, look, not every foreigner who wants to join our people wants to like subvert our goals and our way of life. Many people, in fact, may want to join the Jewish people wholeheartedly, and we should be welcoming them in, because who knows, the Messiah may come from them. Right? It's really kind of a very powerful counterpoint. And I think it's important in the world that we live in, the 21st century, where we're in a free market society of religion, and people can choose whatever religion they want to be, that we welcome people who choose to want to join our people. This is something we should be happy and ecstatic even in welcoming people who want to join our people, add to our ranks, and strengthen our communities. So the book of Ruth, in my opinion, is a wonderful book to support that proposition, and it is universally accepted in the Jewish world as an example of a model Jew by choice. Ruth is clearly the model Jew by choice. Her statement about do not turn me away from following you, because wherever you go, I will go. That whole statement is frequently used at conversion ceremonies, because we see her as sort of the model of what it means to be committed to the Jewish people. What I would add is that also in the world we live in today, because we live in a free market, Jews could also choose not to be Jewish, God forbid. We're a very small people, so we need all of us to stay engaged. But the fact that Jews choose to continue to be part of our people, to choose to follow our mission, in a sense also makes them converts, right? They've willingly chosen to be continuing participants in the agenda of Judaism. And what is that agenda? In essence, it is to believe that there is one God who created the universe, who loves and cares about us deeply, and wants us to be good, wants us to do justice and kindness in the world, not only to Jewish people, but to everybody, because we all descend from Adam. And the planet God gave to humanity and left humanity in charge of the planet. So the Jewish way of life is a particular approach to God. It's a particular way of looking at what God wants from us. But it's also a universal message of trying to be an example of how to promote kindness and compassion, like the book of Ruth does, as well as justice and honesty in the world. We don't always live up to that mission, but that is the mission of the Jewish people. So as I said, we read this book on Shavuot because it talks about the harvest season, and Shavuot is a harvest festival, because it talks about Ruth's commitment to the Jewish people, where she accepts the Jewish way of life. I mentioned that her name kind of indicates that, so let me mention that here too. So her name Ruth is from 3 Hebrew letters, Resh, Vav, Taf. And as many of you know, each letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a number equivalent. The first 10 letters are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so it's Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, that's the first 10. And then there's 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. Resh is the number 200, because it's at the end of the alphabet. Taf, the very last letter, is 400. So if you add Resh and Taf together, you get 600, right? 200 plus 400 is 600. And the middle letter, Vav, is 6. So together you have the number 606. Now, for those of you who know, in the Jewish tradition, we say that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, contain a total of 613 commandments. Here we have the number 606, very close to 613, only 7 commandments short. Where do the other 7 commandments come from? Well, the Jewish tradition believes that God gave to Noah the the second Adam after the flood, right? The father of all humanity, the second father of all humanity. God came to Noah when he came off the boat. He gave Noah 7 commandments to live by. Have a justice system, don't murder, don't steal, don't torture animals. 7 commandments. I won't go into them for now. They're called the 7 commandments of Noah. So in our view, all of humanity is obligated for these 7 commandments that deal with morality. So Ruth, by her very name, 606, indicates that she was destined to take on the extra 606 commandments of the Jewish people, because 606 plus 7 is 613. And so her name kind of represents the idea of accepting converts, and that converts accept the way of life of the Jewish people. And just as she accepted those commandments herself, so we accepted the commandments at Mount Sinai when we got the 10 Commandments, which is what we celebrate on Shavuot. So there is another connection to the holiday. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this explanation of the Book of Ruth. Reading the book itself would not take this long. It's a very short read. It's only 4 chapters. But I hope I've explained some of the details and elements. I'm happy to answer questions that you might have once you read it, and if you decide there's something I didn't cover. So please leave your comments in the Facebook page, and I will return and answer your questions as soon as I can. Thank you for joining us at lunchtime. Have a good rest of the week, and I hope you will enjoy a happy Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, the giving of the 10 Commandments.